Today we will be recording this via Zoom, as well as hopefully if Facebook works with us today on live on our Facebook. However, it is giving me a little bit of technical difficulties at the moment. So hopefully we will be in that venue soon. So if you are attending via Zoom, there's a little bit of housekeeping right now. You all are muted. However, you can contact Joyce and I through the chat box, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, it will automatically guide you to anything you send will be sent to all panelists. If you would like to change that and have it sent to the group as well, you can click the to field and it will change to all panelists and attendees. That means it's shared with everyone. Either way, Joyce and I will receive any message that you send our way, and I will be the one who is interrupting Joyce at different times during today's webinar with the questions that you all send. So if you have questions, comments, please feel free to use the chat box. And we will answer questions as we go along. And then once I get Facebook Live up and going, I will also be fielding comments from that as well. So I believe that's it for our housekeeping. And without further ado, I will introduce Joyce Tomaselli. She works with us at Cornell Cooperative Extension, Dutchess County. And she's here today to talk to you about composting and the benefits of organic matter in home garden soil. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And there you go, Joyce.
Thank you. And I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to find that. And I'm going to say share. And I'm going to say from beginning, there. So welcome and happy 50th anniversary Earth Day, everybody. I'm old enough to remember the first Earth Day. I was on the student council in my junior high school, and we convinced the principal and the teachers to let us out for the afternoon, and we went around the neighborhood and we picked up garbage, litter. So it's 50 years is a long time ago, and also I have my little homemade mask, which I've learned to sew because I was a 4-H'er when I was in school. Today we're going to talk about composting and why we compost and why it's good for our soil. So a little bit of background, the agenda, why compost, how we do it. We're going to get into some of the science of soil and some of why how organic matter changes soil, and then a last little bit of caution about pH, which is something else you can do, you can manage in your soil. But before I go further, why we compost is shown in a couple of these screens here. This is information from the US EPA. It's last year's report based on 2017 facts and figures. And we've been following this as we talk about composting and waste management for 6-7 years, and it hasn't changed a lot. One of the points here is that municipal solid waste, MSW, across the United States, and it tracks pretty closely here in New York and here in the Hudson Valley, is represented in the pie chart to the left there. And the EPA estimates that 75% of our waste stream can be either recycled or composted, which is pretty amazing until you look. I mean, it's food, it's yard trimmings, paper, wood. So there's a lot of material that can be recycled, which you've talked about other times today, or composted, which I'm talking about today. In 2019, the report on 2017, this says that the amount that was recycled is shown on the left there. The amount that's composted was shown on the right. But even though 35% of our municipal solid waste was recycled or composted, only 8% of plastic was recycled and only 6% of food waste was recycled. Food scraps, food waste in this case, because sometimes it's both. So we have a good idea that we can do more. Earlier today, later today, you'll learn about plastic, but we're talking today about waste, food waste, composting. We've got a lot of way to go. And the last piece of data here from this EPA report is that, okay, so here's Earth Day, 1970. We have been, as a nation, generating more and more and more solid waste. We were doing pretty good on recycling more and more and more, and now it's plateaued. Hang on, wrong button. Composting, I was looking negative and it means negligible. So I think in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, no one was even bothering to measure. You either were on a farm or in a backyard with a compost pile or you weren't. But while we have had growth in composting, that also has stagnated in the last couple of years, in the last couple of decades. I'm not going to get into combustion here, but realize in Dutchess County, as an example, we have a waste energy plant that's 30 years old, maybe more. That is one of the things where waste is burned to create energy. And here is the other sad thing, that again, while we have made progress about landfills and disposal and how much is going into landfill, we're just absolutely stagnant right now. So as we go into composting, Danielle, do you want to put up that poll, or are you still challenging with Facebook?
I can put up the poll.
Thank you.
All right, here we go. Launch polling.
Simple question. Do you compost, and do you compost well? If you hit the buttons, oh, yay, okay. So we have lots of composting, and we're vacillating back and forth on how well we compost. Well, I like to say that every day I learn something, so it'll be good when we all learn more. We've got a pretty good amount of input here. Okay. So we have 76% saying yes, we compost, and we have 71% saying they don't compost well. So we all have opportunities to improve. Now, what do I do? Do I minimize this, Danny? Yeah, okay, cool. Why am I not paging down? Ooh. Oh, there we go. So why do we compost? We compost because it lowers the amount of waste, municipal solid waste. We also compost because when we finished our work composting, we have a product called organic matter. That improves our soil. It helps the management of water to and from and in and out and within our soil. And it also has other just incidental uses that we can always find a way to use what we created. I'm going to be precise here and point out, I have a British friend who points out how lazy the Americans are with the English language. He's right. We tend to use the word composting in many ways. We use it as a verb. I'm going to go out to the compost pile. What's that, an adjective? I'm going to take compost and put it on my soil. I'm going to try and be precise here, where composting is the practice of managing decomposition. And when we have finished compost, there are characteristics of that organic matter where I want to be precise talking about organic matter from a scientific point of view. So what is it? We'll go through some things here. Okay, home composting. Bottom line, at the end of the day, in the center, anything that was once alive is going to decompose. Managed decomposition is going to help the rate at which it decomposes, the thoroughness in which it decomposes, and in some cases, whether seeds and pathogens are managed or killed during that decomposition process. With home composting, we talk about it being aerobic. It requires oxygen. And that's because we're depending upon living micro and macroorganisms to actually do the decomposition under our guidance. When you get to, there are processes which are called anaerobic, like anaerobic digesters that are used in commercial instances where heat is applied or other containers are used that no oxygen is required, but we are oxygen requiring, and that helps us remember that it's a really alive organism that we're managing. Home composting is also often called cold composting. Oh, I hit the wrong button again. That's my favorite picture in a second. It's small scale. We have 3 by 3 by 3 cubic feet volumes. We have a pile. We have a couple of piles. But we're doing it with a garden fork, not machinery. Again, when you're looking at commercial composting, if you ever go up and look at McEnroe's compost system up there in Millerton, they have huge tractors that are turning it, and they get it really hot, and so they can put more product materials into that compost and yet have a safe, stable end product. So we're aerobic, small scale, cold. This is the favorite picture. And when we're at the Dutchess County Fair, thank you to Kathy Smith and Linda Logerato, Master Gardener volunteers who created this. This is something that we can talk about in 2 minutes or 30 minutes. And today I'll give you maybe 3 or 4. This one image has a lot of information about the compost pile. And when I talk to kids, I say, the compost pile is a living being, and like every living being, you need water, you need food, you need air, and you need a structure. So however we pile, the compost is our structure. We're going to construct it that air is going to be able to come in, that water and heat and a little bit of CO2 is going to be able to evaporate. We have the food that's coming in, and I'll talk about that. And at the end of the day, we have finished compost, and see, I'm bad, that should be saying finished organic matter. But we have a finished product which is stable, which is then going to help our soil. This whole, within this process, within this structure, within the pile, is an amazing food web. And all the different micro and macroorganisms within this food web are working really hard to help the materials decompose and decompose well. So one of the first things that starts is the fungi, the bacteria, and the molds. The bacteria are really the hard workers, and the fungi, and they are what are going to create heat and cause the compost pile to heat up, which we'll get to in a minute, but it's really important because that's where you're going to get speed in your decomposition. The next layer is where you have the protozoa, the springtails. They not only feed on these fungi and bacteria, but they feed on the edges of the material that they're starting to, now my phone is ringing and other things are happening, go away. But they're starting to feed on the other organisms as well as doing more shredding and grazing of the material so that it can start to break down. And then you have the earthworms, you have sow-bugs, you have all sorts of other cool insects. This is why you tend to build your compost pile on the soil, because they live in the soil and they will migrate up into your compost. Sometimes we get a question saying, well, shouldn't I buy a compost starter? No, let the earth feed itself. Let the earth provide these macro and microorganisms. So we've got the decomposers, we've got the shredder grazers, we've got the invertebrates, we have materials that are coming in, and then the finished organic matter that's coming out.
Joyce, we have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you add the shredders, grazers to your compost pile?
They will find their way. There are some, especially if you have the structure on bare soil. There are some compost bins that you can buy, and it's not the more you pay, the more it's worth, but you can get tumblers that you can turn, and water is able to come in. But with those, it's recommended that you take some shovels full of soil or leaf mold or leaf litter and put it in, and that will be how you would be introducing all of those wonderful macro and microorganisms.
Great, thank you very much.
So the food in terms of the organic materials, right? We're recycling somewhere else on our property, but the organic materials are classified, divided into 2 main areas. We talk about the browns, which have a lot of carbon. They tend to be dry. And we talk about the greens that have more nitrogen, that tend to be wet. And we'll talk about more about that, but we need a combination of those. And part of that is because as we're mixing all of this, we need to have space and air and places for those macro microorganisms. If you just put in a glop of green materials, it would probably rot, but it would not necessarily decompose nicely. The carbon and the nitrogen ratio is always referred to as the C to N ratio, and there are categorizations that are available for the different sorts of foodstuff, the materials that you would put into your compost pile. The browns are high in carbon and they're used for the macro-microorganisms for food. The greens are higher in nitrogen, and they need that for growth and reproduction. Oh, I just thought of this. It's kind of like the blades, the growth above the ground, and then the food below the ground. Anyhow, when you think about what you have as food materials, as materials for your compost pile, you're looking for a 30-to-1 brown and green mix, and that's just a ratio. Garden waste, when you pull out your plants and you throw them in the compost pile, it's perfect. They decompose beautifully. They have some soil on them. They have some dead material. They have some green material. Weeds, same thing. Hopefully you don't have seeds on them. If you were to take something that was really high carbon, a bunch of cardboard, it's going to sit there for months or years. That's why you use it for mulch, because it can't provide the growth reproduction. They could use it for food. They could start digesting it, but they couldn't then reproduce and grow. If all you did was put a bunch of grass clippings down, a lot of high nitrogen, you would get the bacteria and the molds and the fungi starting to decompose that, but then it would just turn into a mucky, smelly mess because they don't have the other half that they need for food. And this is referring to the material composition, not the volume. I'm going to talk about volume in a second. So let's pretend my neighbor runs an Italian bakery. He has a lot of coffee grounds. So he has a lot of coffee grounds, and he keeps a lot of newspaper, or he keeps a lot of leaves, and that's what is his perfect compost pile. Grows great tomatoes, Italian. I love to take my leaves in fall and my grass in fall and clip them all up and put them in a pile, and they're beautiful compost 6 months later. People get in trouble when they start dutifully collecting vegetable scraps or fruit waste. And that's because it's a lot lower in the browns than you expect. So when you go out with a bucket of, oh, I went back again. Okay, I'll go forward now. So when you go out with a bucket of green, you really need 2 to 3 parts brown. This is the volume that you've got to balance. So as I was saying before I hit the wrong button, when you have a lot of vegetable scraps and you have a lot of fruit waste, you really need to balance it with shredded newspaper, shredded office paper, leaves, wood shavings. Otherwise, you're going to have a compost pile that's getting higher and higher ratio of nitrogen, and those macro microorganisms aren't going to be able to survive and thrive.
Joyce, we have a question.
Good.
I have had a functioning compost pile for 10 years on a slab. It gets mostly emptied twice a year. Would it function significantly better on soil?
Probably. You could find that slab for a sculpture. Yeah, it probably would perform better on the soil. Because if you think about it, in the winter time, you've got this compost pile that's frozen on the outside. It's not frozen on the inside. Or as it gets cold, those organisms can go down into the deeper soil where they're warmer, and then they can migrate back and forth. So it's providing the initial source for those organisms, as well as seasonal variation. If you put a compost pile in a place that gets too hot, they can go down where it's cooler.
Great. We have actually 2 more questions. One is, what kind of manures are you talking about?
So manures, thank you, Jen Fimble, my agricultural colleague. Manures depend a lot upon the animal which produced them. I hope I get this right. Cows don't digest seeds as much, and they eat grasses. And if you buy a lot of cow manure that has decomposed slowly and you use it, you're probably going to be introducing a lot of grass seeds to your garden. If it has been processed such that it got really hot, it could kill those seeds. Chicken manure, I believe, is a lot higher in nitrogen because I think they pee and poop in the same places. So depending upon what it is the animal is. I know that a nice manure is horse manure that is coming from places that the horses bed on wood shavings, because now you've got your greens and your browns, and what they're eating is not seedy. So manures, be careful, because you may be introducing something you don't want to.
Okay, great. And one more question for right now is, I use a paper towel as a filter in my coffee pot. Can all of that be thrown in the compost pile?
It sure can. I do the same thing now. I put a paper towel down, because if I forget to bring the thing out for a couple of days, when I do dump it, it all comes out in a nice glop instead of me having to scrape it around.
Oh, we
Yes.
actually had 2 more questions just come in. Is that okay?
Sure.
We live in a woodsy area. We have a fenced-in yard because we have 5 dogs. 1, would the microorganisms in the compost pile spread to other areas of the yard and affect the dogs? I'm thinking along the lines of embedded ticks. And 2, it seems to me that a compost pile would naturally attract other animals, bears, groundhogs, etc.
Okay, I'll get to the attraction in a second. And things like ticks don't eat greens and browns, they eat blood. So no, you're not spreading unnatural organisms through your backyard. If you're concerned, you could put a nice ring of wood chips or mowed area around that compost pile, so that if there was something that was there you didn't want spreading, it probably wouldn't go over the chipped area or the dry short mown area.
Okay, great. And then this one says, any animal that eats meat in their diet is not good for composting. Stick to manures from grain-fed animals. Chicken,
Cool.
rabbits, goats, cows, horse manure, all okay. Avoid cat and dog manure.
And I'll talk about cat and dog. Good. So see, we learn something every day. So that's perfect. Thank you.
Great. That's all we have for right now, but I'll keep you posted.
Okay. So how we build our compost pile, no, I'll say it differently. As we now are walking around with our bucket of greens and 3 buckets of browns, the way to start a compost pile and continue it is sort of in layers. When you first start, it's nice to put some sticks or maybe some rocks or something on the bottom, so that if you go back to my pretty green picture, you have the air that's coming through and coming up. Also, if you have any leachate that's just going down within that area where it can stay, the person with the concrete slab, if they move all their compost, they're probably going to find that it's stained underneath there. And if they put it on the ground, or if they even put some sticks on top of that slab, they probably would get more air movement. Then what you do is you put down your layer of browns, you put down your greens, and you throw some more browns on top. So I go out to my compost pile, I empty my kitchen bucket. I happen to have a second one where I store all my leaves from the winter, and where I have shredded paper from USDA next door, and I put that on top of it, and then I go back indoors. Now you're doing that so that you're creating a layer, you're creating a mixture that those micro and macroorganisms can move within. But also, when you put that layer of browns on the top, you're suppressing any smells that might attract a curious small animal. And so you just keep doing the layers. And you can do that in an informal pile, you can do that in a fancy smancy tower, but day by day, just always be layering your greens and your browns. So here's some of the things not to compost. So seedy, invasive, diseased, or other pathogen potential sources. Remember I said we're small and we're cold? We don't normally, unless you're really good, get the compost pile hot enough, long enough to destroy seeds, to destroy. How are plants invasive? They're invasive because they spread by rhizomes. If you pulled up a bunch of mugwort and you threw it in your compost pile, you'd have all those lovely seeds and roots able to keep reproducing, such that when you use it, you're introducing it into your garden. Diseases. If you've got tomato plants, as an example, that have early blight, if you've got potatoes or tomatoes that potentially could have late blight, you never put those diseased end plants in your compost. Same reason, we don't get them warm enough. And then with dog and cat manure, it's just not good. We live with these dogs and cats. If they have pathogens, we don't want to introduce that into our food garden, as an example. So manures, as someone else was pointing out, with any meat-eating animal. You just don't do that. It's not wise. You don't put in dairy products, grease, fats, meats, fish, bones. And that is where you're going to be attracting the bear, the raccoon, the opossum. They're also going to break down very slowly. Commercial composting, hot composting, deals with that just fine. But we don't want to do that in our home compost pile. You know, if you've got some heavy cream that got onto your paper towels, that's fine, but don't throw a hunk of cheese out there. Some people tend not to put big pieces of moldy bread out because that could attract some pests. Other people just let it dry and then crunch it up and then throw it out in smaller pieces, and it decomposes quite quickly. Don't put in wood ash. I also don't put wood ash necessarily in large quantities in your garden. It tends to be too alkaline. You would never put in ash from a charcoal grill because the charcoal is treated with chemicals to make it burn quickly and hot. So don't put the wood ash in, or only small quantities. And finally, glossy paper. The New York Times Style magazine, you would not use because sometimes there might be harmful inks. All of the newspaper grocery inserts that we're getting now with colored pictures, that is all soy-based ink, and that's just fine to put into your compost pile. I've been asked, what about grocery receipts? And I guess not. I mean, that crumples up small enough to be into your recycle bin.
Joyce, I just had a clarifying question because somebody asked why wood ash was bad. Could you explain what you mean by too alkaline in large quantities? How does that affect the pile?
So a lot of wood ash is going to raise the pH of our soil. And later on, and I am watching my time, later on we're going to talk about the fact that when you've got a range of pH that's too low or too high, it's difficult for the nutrients to be picked up by the plants.
Gotcha.
So a lot of wood ash can make it too high in pH.
What about lump wood charcoal?
You know, if you really got to get rid of it, I suppose you could put it in the compost. It's going to take a long time to decompose.
Okay. And then the last question, should you wet down the paper before adding to pile?
I will talk about water next.
Great.
No, I'll talk about water in a sec.
Okay.
So those are the basics. The other thing, you need to have oxygen. One of the reasons that, well, I told you about aerobic and how these organisms need oxygen. You turn it depending upon the weather, depending upon the time of year, depending upon what sorts of material you put in there. If you put in a lot of small material in the summertime and it hasn't rained, you're probably not only going to turn it, but you're probably going to water it. If you've put in a lot of material over the winter, it has stayed cool and dry, maybe some snow melted, but you really don't need to focus so much on turning it until it's getting very active again. You just use a garden fork and you turn it over. Sometimes you can take that garden fork and just push it underneath. If you see there's layers that you're starting to get decomposition and layers you're not, you're going to turn it. So you're turning it to get oxygen available. As I say to some of the kids, once those bacteria and fungi can decompose what it is they can touch, they don't have legs and they can't get further. So you're also turning it to give them access, fresh access. So turning it is for oxygen and a couple of other reasons. Water, too wet and too cold, or too wet and too dry is bad too. So if you squeeze it and you get a couple of drops of water, it's okay. If you squeeze it and you've got muck in your hand, it's too wet and you probably need to turn it. If you squeeze it and it falls apart in your hand, you probably not only need to turn it, but you also need to water it. A good place to put a compost pile is under a deciduous tree that it gets the rain and the sunshine, the rain all year round, the sunshine in the winter, but the coolness in the summer, and so it stays a better temperature and better moisture. So if you were putting in a lot of dry things and you wanted to go ahead and throw water on, empty the dog's water dish at the same time too. A variable is surface area. And some analogies talk about a big block of ice and little bits of ice, but I like the wood chips a little bit better. You want something that's medium sized. If you did nothing but huge wood chips, you have a lot of aeration and you don't have to turn the pile very often, but it takes a really long time to break down. If you, on the other hand, put in a whole clump of sawdust, it's going to pack and nothing's going to get in there to help it decompose. So that's why shredded paper or wood shavings, there's a carpentry guy just down the road here. And Danielle, don't you go and get the wood shavings, or is it
Nope.
Michelle?
I definitely do. We use it.
There you go. That's our secret. Don't tell anybody. So you want something that's variable just in terms of the sizes of what's going in. When you have, let's pretend that you forgot the carrots were in the bottom drawer and you opened them up and they had started growing and you don't want to use them. You could throw a whole bunch of whole carrots in your compost pile and they're still going to be there 6 months later. Take the time, chop them up, right? So you want sort of a medium size. That's why I mow over my leaves as well as my grass. So you've got sort of a medium size of the material. And then the temperature. I referred to this several times, and this is pretty important. This is a day of composting, which would be if you're really, really, really good. And I'll tell you that my leaves and my grass compost in 1 year because I'm a lazy composter and I'm not really, really good, but I do have good compost at the end of a year. If you were really proactively managing a compost pile, you would put your materials in, and as they started decomposing, the temperature would rise. And that's called the mesophilic phase. It's going to rise for some time, and that's the thermophilic phase. And what you're hoping for is to keep it or get it to between 90 and 150 degrees. Above 150, it's going to be starting to kill the macro and microorganisms, those aerobic needing things that are keeping this alive. Up to that and through that, you're going to be killing seeds or pathogens or small things and helping other things be removed from it. So what a real proactive decomposer composter does is you can get temperatures, thermometers, and you can find that as the heat goes up, it'll get to a point where it evens off, and then it starts going down again, and that's when you would turn it, and you're going to see a spike, and you're going to see it stay up, and then it'll start gradually going down. You're going to keep turning it, maybe 2-3 times, maybe more, depending upon what you put in there. Eventually, it'll stop heating up anymore, and that's when it's almost finished and you're in the curing phase. Okay? So one of the first years I was doing this, I went to a conference in Ithaca, and it was really fun listening to the people brag how quickly they could go from, just their kitchen and their leaves and their grass to beautiful compost. And in 60 days is doable. I don't think most of us are that good, but go for it. The curing phase is the last one. So this was the summary on composting. I'm okay on time. We need to think about what's coming in, the materials in terms of the foodstuffs, greens and browns. We're thinking about what the actual micro and macroorganisms are in there and the air and water that is needed to keep all of this alive. We're thinking about the process inside where it's all decomposing. Some water is transpiring. It's giving off some heat. It's giving off some carbon dioxide, not as much as other bad things. And at the end of the day, you've got your finished compost. I mentioned it briefly before, but the most productive compost pile is 3 cubic feet by 3 cubic feet by 3 cubic feet. And that gives you the volume that you need to get it nice and hot and let it cool down and go through this system. Smaller systems work, but the ideal is a 3 by 3 by 3. So if you've got the space and you want a Cadillac, this is one of the composting systems that people like to build. It's called a 3-bin unit. This is showing wood, but get wood pallets from the side of the road. use a cable tie, put them together. They work just fine. And the deal here is that you fill the first side, and these usually slide up so that you've got an opening in the front here. See, it shows it here. And so you fill the first one, and when that gets hot, nice and hot and needs to be turned, you turn it into the second one, right? And then you fill this one, and then you turn this one into this one, and you turn this one into this one, and you fill this one. And the third one is usually finished with finished compost when you're ready to use it. You can get smaller things if you don't have the luxury of a big backyard. This is a tower unit. It's about the size of a garbage can. They are on the ground. You would open this front and you would shovel the compost out of the bottom. This is theoretically something that you could plunge in there to turn it. It doesn't work very well for me, but it is something that's nice for a smaller area. And there's a lot of other things you can do that you can even build small systems that you could use on the patio of the balcony of your apartment. So there's a lot of different units that can be used. And I think at the end, I've got some resources that talk about this.
Joyce, we have a question.
Yeah.
How do you monitor the temperature?
You can get a thermometer. It's $30. Lee Valley, any good garden store, and it's fairly long and it has a reading. You can just take your fork and put your hand in. You can feel when it's hot. If you want it nice and hot in the middle, or you can use an actual temperature. I think there might be something too that measures humidity, water. Go
Great.
shopping. So the way you can use it is, next we're going to get into detail on healthy soil. You can use organic matter as a mulch. I do that a lot. When I have my garden beds already, my ornamental garden beds, I use it as a mulch in the summer. The next year I'm going to turn it in. I take my rose bushes, and in autumn I heap up organic matter around the whole rose bush, and in spring I spread it out and then I turn it under. So it can be used as a mulch, and it can be used with your potting soil. Since I live on rock, I grow tomatoes sometimes in a big manure bucket, and I'll take Pro-Mix and I'll add compost. And you can also, with moderation, broadcast a little bit on your lawn. It will help just sort of work its way into the soil. You don't want too much because you don't want runoff, and you don't want so much that you actually are suppressing your lawn when you were trying to help your lawn. Troubleshooting. It can be too cold. It can be stinky. It can be soggy. Nothing can be happening. Bugs are everywhere. Or animals can be in the compost. I used to have a mouse until someone shrieked in the audience when a rat came up, so I changed it to a bunny rabbit. I'm worried a little bit about time, but when you think about what you need to balance air, water, food, browns, greens, you can understand some of the troubleshooting. If nothing's happening, it could be winter. Oh, stop it. Go back. It could be winter. It could be that you don't have greens and browns. It could be that the compost isn't heating up anymore because it's finished. And if you reach and you smell it and it's just a beautiful loamy smell, you have finished compost, and so you can start using it. If they're matted or they're not breaking down, you probably want to turn it. If it's stinky, it has gone anaerobic. You don't have the oxygen that you want, and so you're going to both aerate the pile and maybe work in some more dry materials. Again, if it smells like ammonia, that means that it's decaying, it's not decomposing. Get your browns and greens. We talked about attracting rodents. Attracting insects isn't bad. If you have a lot of ants, that probably means it's too dry. We had a school, they were so happy in spring. They made their compost pile and their compost bin, and they put it underneath the overhang, and they left for the summer, and they came back in September, and it was filled with yellow jacket bees. It had gotten way too dry. No one had turned it, and what was a beautiful thing for the children now became a nasty thing for the children, and they had to get it out of there. So don't let things get too dry, and if you have unusual insects, that's usually the problem, that it is too dry. Okay, that was the act of managing decomposition and creating organic matter. Why? Because it's an important component of soil. Soil is also a dynamic ecosystem. It's alive. More of it's dead than not, but a lot of it's alive. And it's surprising, but half of soil, when it's properly drained, is air or water, and the other half is minerals or organic matter. The minerals are where the nutrients are. They need to be in the water soluble for the plants to take them up. Organic matter helps that happen. Soil, if you think about it, we grow plants. It helps drain our water. Anyone have a well and a septic system? What's it doing? It's purifying waste. Things naturally decompose. It recycles nutrients. It provides a habitat for all these cool soil organisms that we're talking about, and we build on it. I mean, soil has all sorts of different uses. We really want to enhance how we're using it for our plants. So this is, I took a geology class a couple years ago at Ulster Community College. Geology initially determines our soil, and New York is cool. Some of the oldest rock in the Northeast is up here at Whiteface Mountain. Down at Bear Mountain, there's a lot of different geology in the Adirondacks. Here you see where Lake Albany, I think it was Lake Albany, broke through and caused the fjord, which is the Hudson River and the Hudson Valley. If you think here, there's a lot of really good growing areas. This is where the glaciers smoothed out a lot of the soil and left topsoil. Some of these areas in here, you can see some really cool geological gullies and things, but geology initially determines our soil. And at the Museum of New York in Albany, you can find more. This is Long Island. Long Island is a moraine. It's a pile of rocks and rubble that the glaciers created as they receded and went forward and back. This is Dutchess County. The pink is bedrock. This down here is bedrock with a stipple overlay. This is variable texture of clay, silt clay, and boulder. We don't have a lot of good soil in Dutchess County. I live on rock. I live right there. I go up one more hill and I can see all the mountains around us. So I live on rock. Weather over time erodes the parent material and starts creating horizons of organic matter, then mineral, and then layered organic and mineral that plants can actually start growing in. So geology, then weather. When you get into soil science, there's a lot of work on all the different soil layers and what they are and their characteristics. We're worried about the top layers because that's where we're growing our vegetables, our ornamentals, or a little bit deeper, our trees. And so what's really important is where the roots are, how wide, how deep or widespread they are, where the water can be retained but also drained so that it's not standing water that could drown your trees, for example. That's the area where there's also nutrient exchange, and that's how much we can manage. So when we dig in our garden, we're only a little bit deep, but that's what we're trying to manage, and those are the layers that are most important. Where I live, I have leaf litter, mineral, and bedrock. So I'm bead raised beds. The texture is really important with soil, and we're going to talk about texture and then structure. So remember I said that soil is 45% minerals and 5% organic matter. The 45% minerals are the size, well, the texture is defined by the size of the minerals, sand, silt, and clay. And the texture is what can affect these things here: drainage, aeration, water holding, etc. If you think about beach sand, not much grows in it. When it rains, it drains really fast, right? If you think about, well, gravel, that's why we put down gravel on a road, because not much grows in it, because it can't retain water and healthy soil. If you think about clay, clay is, when it gets dry, it's super, super dry, and you can hardly dig through it sometimes. But when you get it wet, it stays soggy for a long time. So the texture is the size of the minerals. Organic matter is not going to affect the texture. We can change the texture of our soil. I buy some soil and I buy some masonry sand, and I use that to amend my clay soil. So you can change how much the proportion is of the texture, but that's sort of a given. There's a way cool, this diagram, it's always used in terms of soil science. It tells you how to figure out what kind of soil that you have. It talks about the different things of what the soil can do. Basically, we like loamy soils to grow in that are some combination of sand, silt, and clay that is not too fine and not too coarse. And this can be used to help you understand how to change the texture of your soil. Not going into that today, but there's a lot of information about that. Now, soil is 5% organic matter. Organic matter is mostly humus, not hummus, that's edible, humus. And that is the very dead, the stable end product of decomposition. It has some biomass, which would be things that aren't necessarily totally decomposed, and it would be, or I'm sorry, the residues and byproducts, and then it would still have those macro and microorganisms. And organic matter, even though it's only 5% of good soil, is really important for several reasons. One thing it does is it helps create what we call aggregates within the soil. And what this does is it makes the soil fluffy enough that it can have place for air and water. The roots need that, the macro microorganisms need that. They need some air and some water so that they can, it's this living, continuing thing, right? Think of, when I said sand, think of sand as analogous to a Scotch-Brite kitchen scrub or a Danny Does It. Water runs through it, it's sharp, it doesn't hold any water, it just dries up very quickly. That's one thing. Think of the clay as a roll of toilet paper. It's really dry unless you soak it, and then it's really wet forever. There's no oxygen in there. You can't do anything with that. Think about good loamy soil with organic matter as your kitchen sponge. It takes in water quickly, it doesn't hold too much water, and it has those pores, those airs, or those holes for water as well as oxygen. That's what organic matter does, is it helps the soil have structure. Structure is why we don't walk on wet soil in spring. It destroys that structure. It makes it all matted down. We like to keep it fluffy. We like to keep it light, and that's what organic matter does. Plants manage water. If they have too much, they wilt. If they have too little, they wilt. If they have too much, they rot. There's all sorts of biology. I studied math and computer science. There's all sorts of biology on plant biology and how they regulate water. But how they regulate water is also tied to how they uptake nutrients. Dissolved particles that are usually on those minerals, that texture, dissolved particles become water soluble, and plants are really clever on how they can get nutrients out of these solutes. And this is one slide that took a very long time for I and some colleagues to make, and it totally glosses over the entire science. But for biochemistry, clay and organic matter have a negative ionic charge. They attract positively charged nutrients that have a positive charge called cations. And they allow those nutrients to disengage from the minerals, the sand, silt, and clay that they're on, get into the water, and now the plants can more easily pick up that nutrition as they need it. So organic matter is not a fertilizer. Organic matter allows plants to pick up nutrition as they need it from the soil. They'll absorb it when they need it, when there are more outside the roots than inside, and when the pH is in a proper range. I told you I'd get back to pH, and this is where we will. And someday, if you're really interested, read more about the whole biochemistry of plants and soil, but this is the science. Soil pH, which is percent hydrogen, is a measurement of how much hydrogen ionic activity exists in the soil and the water solution. Acid has more hydrogen ions, and alkaline has more, I don't remember what the OH ions are. But if you're at the ends of the pH scale, nutrients can become either really soluble and plants pick up too much of them, or they can not be able to take too much. Not be able to take them in because they're bound. This is the actuality. These are examples of pH: water, urine, black coffee, drain cleaner, right? So this is the high pH here is called alkaline. The low pH is called acid. And the nutrients that our plants need are most easily picked up between 6 and 7, between a value of pH of 6 and 7. That's what our soil almost normally around here is. You can goof that up with too much wood ash and put it up here, and so you're not going to be able to get some of the needed nutrition. If pH is too low, you can get things like not enough nitrogen, and so you can get yellowing of plants. So how much organic matter you put into your soil is one thing you can manage, but also measuring the pH of your soil is a second thing you can do to ensure that your plants are getting the nutrients that they need. So we talked about making compost, and then the value of organic matter is that it makes the soil spongier such that it can hold water but also drain better. There can be air that the roots and the microorganisms need, and also it helps attract, hold, and release nutrients in the soil. So organic matter is really important in your soil, and there, still looking at the time, doing all right, we can reduce solid waste by managing the decomposition of it instead of throwing it into the garbage. We produce organic matter, which really helps our soil. The soil only has 5% organic matter, but it's really, really important to the health of the soil and the ability of plants to pick up nutrients as they need it. That is what I had prepared to present. Questions?
Great, thank you very much, Joyce. I'll wait a couple of seconds to see if anybody has any questions to type into either the Facebook Live or to the Zoom. Lots of comments about, a lot of people learned so much today.
Do you want to do the second poll?
Yeah, let's do the second poll while people think about their other questions. So here's the second poll. Now that you know.
Will you compost more, and will you compost better? There's a lot of information at Cornell Waste Management Institute. We've done some good things here at Cornell, Dutchess County, sponsored by the county a few years ago, and we'll make sure that this information comes back to you in however we will be doing that then.
Great. I'm not seeing any questions popping up, so thank you very much. Everybody seems very excited to start composting. They said great information. Will the presentation / slides be available? Yes. So this is being recorded. This Zoom webinar is being recorded, and this version of the Zoom webinar will be posted on the Facebook later today once it's completed its download. It is also going to be recorded from the Facebook Live, but that is not a complete version because I had some technical difficulties and started late. So the complete version of this entire presentation in video format will be on the Facebook later today.
And what comes up next and what time, Daniel?
So next is, there is a video that will be posted to the Cornell Cooperative Extension Dutchess County Facebook page that is a pre-recorded video about spring nature walks for families at 4 p.m. And then at 5 p.m., Get Drastic with Plastic is going to be with Cornell Cooperative Extension Putnam County, and our educator, Michelle Gluck, will be there as well. And that will not be broadcast on Facebook Live, but you do have to pre-register for that. So if you haven't done that yet, go to our website www.ccedc.org and register for that, because it'll be a great session as well.
And happy 5th anniversary Earth Day.
Yay, happy Earth Day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.